The midsummer air hung thick with the scent of roses and rain, as though the heavens themselves disapproved of the gaiety below. Wexbury Hall gleamed beneath 100 lanterns, its gardens glittering with candlelight and diamonds alike. Carriages arrived in steady procession, depositing guests wrapped in silks and laughter, each intent upon being admired. Inside, the orchestra played a waltz of perfect precision, and in the whirl of satin and fanfare, Lady Eleanor Harcourt stood very still. She was neither the most radiant nor the most daring among them. Her gown was a modest creation of dove-gray silk, hemmed by her own hand, and her only adornment was a small pearl brooch once belonging to the late Duchess. Yet there was an unstudied grace about her, a quiet intelligence in the way her eyes observed rather than sought attention. It was a misfortune of her birth that she stood among those whose kindness was measured always by condescension. For Eleanor was not of their world, at least not truly. She was the orphan daughter of a ruined viscount, rescued from obscurity by the Duke of Wexbury's late mother, who had declared that the girl should be raised as one of our own. The Duke himself, Adrian Pembroke, 30 years of age, golden and grave, had kept that promise faithfully. Since boyhood, he had treated her with all the affection and protectiveness of an elder brother, a habit so firmly rooted in duty that it had never once occurred to him to look at her otherwise. Tonight, however, that unthinking constancy would wound her more cruelly than any deliberate slight. The orchestra paused. Conversation rippled through the marble hall like the fluttering of wings. Eleanor, fetching a glass of lemonade, was intercepted by Lady Charlotte Ravenshire and her retinue of silk-clad friends. They had the glossy sheen of youth that comes from never having been uncertain of one's place. Charlotte's smile carried the sweetness of arsenic. "My dear Miss Harcourt," she began, glancing pointedly at Eleanor's gown, "how charmingly simple you look. It is so refreshing, in an age of ostentation, to see one unafraid of appearing modest." The laughter that followed was delicate but cutting. Eleanor's hand tightened on the glass. She managed a polite smile, unwilling to betray hurt. But Charlotte was not finished. "I dare say your guardian must be proud," she continued. "The Duke is forever surrounded by beauties, and yet he keeps you near. How secure you must feel, like a sister to him, is it not so?" Eleanor's pulse faltered. Before she could reply, a familiar baritone intervened. "Indeed," came the Duke's voice, calm and clear, "Lady Eleanor is quite as a sister to me, and to all who hold this house in affection." The words were meant to protect her. Yet as he spoke them, a hush fell. Charlotte's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Around them, the laughter swelled once more, polite and poisonous. Eleanor's cheeks burned. To be dismissed as like a sister before so many eyes, spoken by the very man whose opinion shaped every room she entered, was a humiliation she had not the composure to endure. She curtsied, murmured some apology about the heat, and slipped away through the open French doors onto the terrace. The night air struck cool against her skin. Beyond the gardens, the first tremor of thunder rolled through the darkening sky. She gripped the balustrade, fighting the sting in her eyes. Inside, music resumed, bright and indifferent. For years she had accepted her place without complaint. Gratitude had been her armor, modesty her refuge. But standing there beneath the drifting rain, she felt that armor crack. A sister, so that was all she would ever be to him, a convenient, harmless presence, good enough to fill a quiet drawing room, never enough to be truly seen. "Eleanor!" His voice came from behind her, soft but commanding. She turned. The Duke stood framed by the glow of the ballroom, the storm at his back lending a strange solemnity to his expression. His coat was immaculate, his gaze steady. "You left rather suddenly," he said. "Are you unwell?" "I'm quite well, Your Grace." He frowned slightly. "Come, you need not address me so formally. Have I offended you somehow?" She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw a man utterly unaware of the wound he had given. "You have said nothing that was not perfectly proper," she replied, her voice low. "I should be grateful for your protection. It was most generous." Something in her tone unsettled him. "Eleanor," he said quietly, stepping closer, "I meant only to spare you their cruelty. You must not think I regard you with anything less than affection," she supplied. "Yes, your grace. Like a sister." The words cut him this time. He hesitated, perhaps realizing their weight, yet unable to retract them. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then steadily darkening his shoulders. She made no move to go inside. "You should come in," he said finally. "You'll catch your death out here." She gave a small, trembling laugh. "Would that make me less of a burden to your reputation?" He stared at her, stunned. She had never spoken so to him. Never with bitterness, never with fire. But before he could answer, she gathered her skirts and turned away, walking swiftly through the garden toward the shadowed colonnade. The rain caught in her hair, turning it to threads of bronze beneath the lightning's brief flash. He called her name once, but the wind swallowed it. Alone now, he stood beneath the storm, his conscience uneasy, though he could not have said why. Inside, the orchestra played on, the company danced, and the great house of Wexbury glittered with untroubled splendor. Yet in the quiet corners of that night, something irreparable had shifted. The Duke, unaware, would remember her laughter fading into the rain and feel, for the first time, a trace of something he could neither name nor dismiss. By dawn, the storm had passed. The roses drooped heavy with water, their scent deepened by the rain. Servants swept the terraces clean, oblivious to the small, damp glove left upon the balustrade, a single trace of the girl who had stood beneath the thunder and resolved, in silence, that she would never again be pitied. London, that restless furnace of ambition and display, received Lady Eleanor Harcourt with the same curiosity it reserved for anything new and improving. The Marchioness of Pembroke, an old friend of the late Duchess and veteran of countless seasons, had taken Eleanor under her formidable wing. Within her Mayfair townhouse, the air was thick with perfume, gossip, and the rustle of silk gowns being fitted to perfection. "The world will never notice you," the Marchioness had said, fastening a sapphire ribbon at Eleanor's throat, "until you give it reason to." And so, under her guidance, Eleanor learned not the art of deceit, but of self-possession, how to speak less, smile slowly, and let silence imply worth. By the end of the first month, London society could no longer ignore her. She was not the prettiest nor the richest debutante, but there was something in her composure that unsettled the idle and fascinated the thoughtful. Men lingered in her company without quite knowing why, and women found in her eyes a quiet defiance that made them uneasy. She danced with ministers, conversed with poets, and received compliments from dowagers who did not often bestow them. It was at Lady Colborne's musicale that she saw him again. The Duke of Wexbury entered with the unhurried grace of a man too accustomed to reverence to notice it. Parliament had drawn him to London, though he despised its noise and novelty. His eyes swept the room with mild detachment until they found her. Eleanor stood near the pianoforte, a vision in pale green silk, her hair swept into a style more elegant than he remembered, her laughter low and unguarded. She was surrounded by admirers, and when she turned to greet him, there was no trace of the timid girl who once fled his company. She curtsied with perfect composure. "Your Grace," she said, "London seems to agree with you." He bowed, faintly unsettled. "I might say the same, though it appears you've quite conquered it." Her smile did not waver. "Perhaps it was merely waiting to see me properly dressed." The remark, so lightly delivered, left him momentarily speechless. He had never heard such irony from her lips. He was struck not by her beauty, though it had deepened, but by the ease with which she held her own. Conversation carried on around them, yet the Duke felt oddly excluded from its rhythm. For the first time, he sensed a distance between them that was not of his making. He saw her often in the following weeks. Always she was surrounded, always gracious, yet never fully accessible. He began to notice details that disturbed his peace. How she laughed more freely with others than she ever had with him. How her gaze no longer sought his approval, as though she had outgrown the need. And then there was the man, the one everyone was beginning to talk about. Mr. Alaric Finch was a new sort of gentleman, the kind born not to titles, but to triumph. His fortune came from railways and iron, his manners from experience rather than pedigree. There was something magnetic in his confidence, unpolished yet sincere. The Duke met him once at a dinner hosted by the Marchioness, where Finch spoke with intelligent candor about the future of industry and the inevitable decline of idle nobility. Adrian had found him uncouth, but undeniably formidable. What he had not expected was the way Finch looked at Eleanor, with admiration stripped of hesitation, as though she were a woman to be pursued, not protected. One evening, at a small gathering in Bloomsbury, Finch presented Eleanor with a curious token, a silver locket shaped like a rosebud, which, when turned by a hidden mechanism, unfurled to reveal a tiny engraving, "To what may yet bloom." The device fascinated everyone, but the Duke, who stood at the edge of the crowd, saw only the intimacy of the gesture. When Finch bent close to explain its mechanism, Eleanor's eyes lifted briefly and met the Duke's across the room. There was no guilt in them, only quiet challenge. Later that night, alone in his carriage, the Duke sat rigid, his gloved hands clenched upon his cane. He could not understand the restlessness that consumed him. It was not love, he told himself. It was propriety. Eleanor had been raised under his roof. Her conduct, in some indirect way, reflected upon his honor. Yet even as he reasoned thus, he saw again her hand accepting that silver rose, her laughter warming a stranger's gaze. The following morning, he called upon the Marchioness, though he told himself it was merely to offer thanks for her hospitality. The conversation soon turned to Eleanor, as it always did. "She has found her footing, has she not?" the Marchioness observed with satisfaction. "I dare say she will have several offers before the season ends." "Indeed," the Duke replied, his tone cool, "though some suitors may not be suitable." The Marchioness gave him a shrewd look. "You speak of Mr. Finch, I assume. The man's origins are humble, but his character is sound, and his wealth substantial. Eleanor could do far worse." "I do not question his fortune," he said evenly. "Only the wisdom of binding oneself to a world so unlike our own." "Our own?" The Marchioness's lips curved faintly. "You speak as though she still belongs to it." The words stung. He left soon after, unable to shake the echo of her implication. For the first time, he wondered if Eleanor's future might unfold entirely beyond the reach of his influence. That evening, he found himself at the balcony of his rented townhouse, watching the carriages rattle along the rain-slicked streets of Mayfair. Somewhere among those flickering lamps was hers, the girl who had once wept under his roof and now moved through the world with unshakable grace. In the days that followed, whispers grew. Lady Eleanor Harcourt and Mr. Finch were inseparable. The notion was absurd, he told himself, yet the thought clung like smoke. He began to avoid the places where she might be seen, though each absence left him more restless than any encounter could. And then, one gray morning, his secretary entered with a letter, brief, delicately written, bearing the seal of the Marchioness. Within were only a few lines. "Eleanor dines privately with Mr. Finch this evening. I thought you should know." The Duke folded the letter without expression. But when he rose from his chair, the papers on his desk trembled in the draft of his movement. Outside, the rain began again, that same soft, relentless rain which had once fallen upon her tears at Wexbury. For the first time in his well-ordered life, Adrian Pembroke understood what it meant to lose something he had never truly possessed. Autumn returned to Wexbury like a memory that refused to fade, soft with mist and melancholy. The leaves burned gold across the hills, the air smelled faintly of smoke, and within the Duke's ancestral walls, silence had grown companionable to regret. Lady Eleanor Harcourt had come back, though not in triumph as London had once promised her, but in retreat. The Marchioness's letter had explained only that the city's admiration can sour swiftly when a woman dares to be noticed. Society, ever hungry for scandal, had whispered too loudly about her closeness with Mr. Finch. Rumor, like frost, had bitten tender reputations, and the safest refuge left to her was the home she had once fled in humiliation. The Duke had received her without ceremony. His expression was courteous, his words carefully chosen, but there was a new gravity in him, as though each syllable cost restraint. When she entered the grand hall, she found it colder than she remembered. Portraits of Pembroke's past seemed to watch her with a silent verdict. He offered her his hand in greeting. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "you are welcome home." Home! The word struck her with bittersweet force. She curtsied, murmured her thanks, and wondered if this return was mercy or punishment. The servants greeted her warmly, yet she saw in their eyes a trace of curiosity. Had the ward become a fallen favorite? She carried herself with dignity, though fatigue shadowed her beauty. In her absence, she had shed the last of her girlhood. Her poise now was born not of innocence, but endurance. Days passed in uneasy civility. The Duke resumed his estate duties, riding out early, returning late, while Eleanor occupied herself with charitable tasks, visiting tenants, reading to the housekeeper's ailing mother, tending the chapel flowers. Their encounters were polite and brief, each careful to avoid the subject that lay between them like a living thing. Yet tension gathered in the air, subtle and electric, as if the house itself remembered what they would not name. One evening, the rain began without warning, drumming softly against the library windows. Eleanor sat near the fire, her embroidery forgotten on her lap. The Duke entered, bringing with him the scent of wet earth and horsehair. He hesitated, then crossed the room. "You have not been out today," he observed. "The weather seemed uncertain," she replied. "I find the quiet agreeable." He looked at her then, not with the detachment of habit, but with something rawer, almost searching. "In London? Was it kind to you?" She met his gaze evenly. "London is never kind, Your Grace. Only interested." He turned from her, staring into the fire. "I hear the talk has been unjust." "Talk is the coin of that world," she said. "I knew the cost before I spent it." Something in her calmness unsettled him. "You need not defend yourself to me." "I'm not defending myself," she said softly. "I am remembering." He glanced at her sharply. "Remembering what?" "How it felt to be small in your house," she answered. "To be pitied for my poverty, corrected for my pride, and reminded that gratitude must be eternal." The word struck him like cold water. "Is that truly how you saw it?" She rose, trembling slightly, though her voice remained measured. "You were kind to me, Adrian. But kindness can wound when it forgets equality. You called me a sister when you knew the word would end me." He flinched as if from a blow. "I meant only—" "I know what you meant," she interrupted, "and perhaps I even deserved it. But it taught me something. Affection that denies desire is not virtue. It is fear." He stared at her, speechless. The fire crackled between them, throwing restless shadows upon the shelves. Outside, the storm gathered strength. "Do you think I'm afraid?" he asked at last, low and dangerous. "Yes," she said simply. "Of yourself most of all." The room seemed to tighten around them. He stepped closer, his restraint quivering on the edge of collapse. "You presume much of my heart. I have lived within it long enough to know its walls," she replied. Her eyes shimmered in the firelight. "You guard your reputation as though it were your soul, but reputation cannot warm a man in the dark." His breath caught. For a moment, the proud Duke looked almost young again, uncertain, undone. "You do not understand," he said hoarsely. "There are duties that bind me. I cannot act upon." She moved toward him, every step deliberate. "Then do not act. Feel. For once, Adrian, feel something that is not dictated by inheritance." He closed his eyes, as though her words were a prayer too dangerous to hear. When he opened them, she was standing before him, close enough that the lamplight brushed her cheek. The silence between them vibrated with all that had been unsaid since that night on the terrace years ago. He reached out, hesitated, then let his fingers graze hers, a fleeting contact but electric. She did not draw back. Their hands remained there, barely touching, until the thunder cracked above and she withdrew, trembling. "I should not have come back," she whispered. "You belong here," he said, voice roughened by emotion. "No," she answered. "I belong nowhere that requires me to forget myself." He wanted to speak, to protest, but she turned away. The storm outside swelled, rattling the windows. The Duke watched her retreating figure, the pale shimmer of her gown vanishing into shadow, and felt the ruin of his composure. He stood for a long time after she was gone, listening to the rain and the echo of her words. In that moment, he understood that jealousy had been the mask of something far deeper, an affection that defied propriety, that had grown quietly over years of denial. Yet now, when truth had finally broken the surface, she was slipping from him again, beyond the reach of apology or command. From the window, he glimpsed the faint lantern of a carriage waiting at the gate. Finch's carriage, unmistakable. The sight cut through him like winter air. He turned from the glass, his heart hammering with a sensation both foreign and inevitable. It was then he realized that all his lineage, his power, his pride, could not save him from the simplest, cruelest truth of all. He had loved her, and it might already be too late. Snow had come early that winter, cloaking Wexbury and all of England in a silence that felt ceremonial. The season of glittering galas and charitable performances had begun, and London thrummed once more with music and malice. Rumor, now fully ripened, had declared Lady Eleanor Harcourt the subject of two men's devotion. The Duke of Wexbury, proud and tormented, and Mr. Alaric Finch, the self-made magnate who defied the aristocracy's scorn. Invitations bearing her name multiplied, not out of kindness, but curiosity. Society had scented a spectacle. The Duke had not seen her since that storm-tossed night in the library. She had left Wexbury at dawn without farewell, leaving only a note of gratitude, so measured it broke him more than any confession could. Since then, he had moved through his duties like a man haunted by his own restraint. Yet when word reached him that she was to attend the winter charity gala at the Hanover Rooms, and that Finch was rumored to make an announcement there, his composure finally gave way. The evening glittered with the artificial perfection of high society. Chandeliers blazed above a crowd powdered and perfumed into elegance. The scent of wax and violets hung heavy in the air, mingling with the distant echo of a string quartet. When Eleanor entered, conversation stilled. She wore a gown of deep crimson, the color of courage, her hair swept high, her expression calm and unreadable. The Duke, standing near the staircase, felt the breath catch in his chest. She seemed both near and impossibly far, as though London itself had claimed her. Finch appeared moments later, unashamed of his plain black coat and unpolished manners. He greeted Eleanor with quiet respect, his sincerity like a wound amid the artifice around them. They spoke briefly, and then he led her toward the dais, where a small orchestra paused in anticipation. The hum of speculation grew louder. The Duke felt himself moving before thought could intervene. Each step carried him through a sea of faces that blurred into insignificance. He could not bear the sound of her name linked to another man's promise, nor the finality it implied. When he reached the foot of the dais, Finch had already taken her hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," Finch began, his voice steady but unadorned, "I wish to express what many of you have guessed. Lady Eleanor Harcourt has taught me that worth is not born but made. It is my hope." He never finished. The Duke's voice cut through the hall, low but resonant, carrying a tremor that silenced the crowd. "You cannot marry him, Eleanor. Not while I draw breath." Gasps rippled through the assembly. The orchestra stilled. Eleanor froze, her hands still caught in Finch's. The Duke's eyes met hers, not as a command, but a confession laid bare. He stepped forward, heedless of decorum, his dignity dissolving into something fiercely human. "Forgive me," he said, his voice unsteady yet clear. "I have loved you long before I knew what love was. I disguised it as guardianship, as duty, as pride, but every word I spoke in your defense was an effort to silence my own heart. I cannot stand aside and watch you belong to another. If I must be ruined to tell you this truth, then let the ruin come." The hall seemed suspended in time. No one breathed. Eleanor's eyes glistened, but she did not move. Finch looked at her, then at the Duke, a faint smile of understanding touching his face. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "the world may call this scandal. I call it honesty." He bowed once, then turned and left the room, his departure as dignified as his love had been unpretentious. The silence he left behind was absolute. Eleanor stood at the center of it, trembling between two lives, the one she had been taught to accept and the one she might yet claim. Slowly, she descended the dais. When she reached the Duke, she lifted her chin, her voice soft but steady. "You have chosen a dangerous hour for honesty. Every hour before this was cowardice," he replied. Her gaze softened, though sorrow lingered there. "They will never forgive you, nor me." "Then let us learn to forgive ourselves," he said. For a moment, neither moved. The crowd, still in stunned silence, seemed to recede until there was only the two of them and the fading echo of the waltz. Then she placed her hand in his, a gesture small but irrevocable. The sound that followed, a collective murmur of outrage, disbelief, fascination, was the first tolling of their exile. In the days that followed, the scandal spread with the efficiency of wildfire. Invitations vanished. Allies turned discreetly away. The Duke, stripped of political favor, retreated to Wexbury with Eleanor by his side. Yet those who expected her to fade into anonymity found themselves confounded. Her calm dignity remained unbroken. Her laughter, rarer but truer, echoed through the once silent halls. Winter yielded to spring, and with it, a strange peace settled over the estate. The townsfolk whispered kindly now of the Duke and his lady, seeing in their quiet union something defiant and pure. He no longer cared for Parliament's approval, nor she for the gossip of salons. They rode together across the thawing fields, content in the freedom that ruin had purchased. One evening, as dusk bled into the valley, the Duke found her in the old rose garden, pruning the first buds of the season. She looked up as he approached, smiling faintly. "I sometimes wonder," she said, "if they still speak of us." "They do," he answered, "but I have stopped listening." She laid her hand over his. "You once said I was like a sister." He smiled a little ruefully. "Then I was a blind man." The wind carried the faint scent of roses, new and uncertain. The world beyond Wexbury might never absolve them, but within its walls they had made something rarer than virtue, truth unshackled from pretense. And as twilight deepened, the narrator's voice, if one had been there to hear it, might have said, "They paid the price all lovers pay in England, where propriety is God and passion a crime." Yet in the hush between disgrace and peace, they found what neither title nor approval could ever grant, the quiet certainty of being truly seen. He had once called her sister, until the sight of her with another man taught him what that word had never meant.